Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 25th Fields on Wheels. If someone had told me some 25 years ago that we'd be doing a program online, I'm sure I would never have possibly believed them because clearly things have changed. Even if they told me 2 years ago we'd be doing this online, I don't think I would have ever believed them, but here we are, so a new frontier. On the other hand, there's certainly benefits that come with this, and we're very pleased to welcome a very large group today. And I don't have your regional addresses, but I do know that there's people coming from across the West and Canada. So again, welcome to the 25th Fields on Wheels. It is my pleasure to introduce our associate dean, Dr. Subbu Krishnan. Sorry, Subbu, if I destroyed your name there.
No
Who is
worries.
going to bring greetings from the university on behalf of the Asper School of Business. Go ahead, Subbu.
Thank you very much, Barry. Good morning to you all. And I suppose in case somebody is in a time zone which is far ahead, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. On behalf of the Asper School, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this 25th year of the Fields on Wheels conference. And Dean Gadi Jacobi sends his regrets for not being here today. The Fields on Wheels conference was conceived in 1996 when it was actually called the Agri-Business Logistics Conference. In fact, Fields on Wheels was the tagline for the conference that year. And starting 1998, it came to be known as the Fields on Wheels Conference. Barry, correct me if I'm wrong.
You're right.
We have had many turbulent times over the past 25 years. The Winnipeg floods of 97, 9/11, SARS, the 2008 recession, H1N1, and now COVID-19, to name a few. But this conference has not missed a single year since 1996. And I must congratulate Dr. Barry Prentice, who has been a common factor through all the 25 editions of the conference. So congratulations, Barry, and happy 25th birthday to the conference. I want to thank the Transport Institute, all our sponsors over the years, industry partners, the Government of Manitoba, Westac, agri-businesses, the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, and the academics who have kept this conference going all these years. Thank you all for your support over a quarter century. And on behalf of the Asper School, I would like to welcome Honorable Minister Schuler. Barry is Minister is here, correct?
Sure, yes.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you, Minister Schuler, for taking the time to show your support for the conference and the university. We really appreciate that. I know we can all talk about how these are unusual, challenging times and that we are having to do this online. But on the positive side, we get to attend the conference with just a mouse click. We're not polluting the environment by traveling. We are able to attend a conference with a $0 conference travel budget. And we get to be in our pajamas in the comfort of our home. I just hope I don't have to stand up at any point during this speech. So it's not all bad. But on a more serious note, COVID-19 has made the world realize the importance of sourcing, distribution, and transportation. The success or failure of many businesses this year has depended on the quality of their supply chain management, as we all know. And no business function is going to be more important than that in the coming year. I'm referring to the distribution of the vaccine to the farthest corners of the world. And much after COVID-19 is behind us, the world will have a bigger problem to, excuse me, the world will have a bigger problem to deal with, and that is climate change. Therefore, it's only apt that this year's conference is starting with a discussion of sustainability and will end the day with a session that will be looking forward. I realize I'm standing in the way of those interesting discussions, so I'll end by welcoming you all once again to this 25th Fields on Wheels conference. Have a wonderful day of knowledge sharing. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. Can I just say one thing? Sorry, my name is Andrew Clark. I'm special assistant to Minister Schuler. He just got delayed by a few minutes this morning, so He'll be joining us in about 15 minutes. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
Thank you very much for letting us know. And I'm not sure what I do now, whether we do a little dance or have a sing song, but what I'm, oh, stop my video, yes. What I propose is maybe to just talk a little bit about the course of the day. You know, we did organize this in the sense that we wanted to focus on resilience and achievement. And there's several kinds of resilience. One kind is preparing for the future. And our first session, just starting off this morning, is going to talk about how we need to think more about climate change, obviously, and and how we prepare for the possibility that we're going to have a much drier climate and maybe a hotter climate. And one of the ways to deal with that is to have better water management. So our first session is going to look at the question of how is the climate changing? And secondly, what are we doing about it? How do we cope with this? We have quite a lot of experience actually in irrigation in Western Canada, although many people, and I'd say including myself, we don't really know very much about it because we tend to think of ourselves as a dryland cropping area, the prairies, and wheat dominates, now wheat and canola dominates everything. So we don't think very much about irrigation, but where we do have irrigation, it's a very significant part of our agriculture. And it's also really important for the processing industry because if you have a climate that fluctuates, you've got maybe some more difficulties trying to operate a processing facility because you can't cope with the ups and downs. You can't tell your customers, sorry, wait, next year we'll have something for you. So as a result of that, having irrigation helps us to build our processing industry. And that's something that we've had as, you know, I look back over the last 25 years, it's always been a desire of Western Canada is to add more value to our crops and do something more with them in the processing side. And we certainly have had some successes. The canola industry is a starring success where roughly half the crop now is processed on the prairies. Where we've had irrigation, we have a potato production and potato processing. And so we've had a great success there. And after the first session, we're going to hear about new developments, which is in the processing of peas. And that's one of the possibilities that we can look at in terms of production. Then in the afternoon, again, we'll be talking about resilience again and how various firms have dealt with the COVID-19 and also what the future will be. And then the last session will deal with the grain industry. This is, of course, the start of the conference. So we started out as a grain transportation conference, and at that time, really in terms of agriculture and transport, that was really the only thing people really did want to talk about, and we had a lot to talk about. Those of us who've been around for some time have observed the grain industry going from a very highly regulated and highly subsidized industry to one which is pretty much today based on open markets and very little subsidy involved in the industry today. As a result of that, of course, many changes went forward, and some of those were specific to in terms of the investments by the private sector. For example, the grain industry invested heavily in high throughput terminals and new terminals at the ports. And the railways, of course, have invested tremendous amounts of money in modernizing their fleets and increasing track space so that there's the bottlenecks are less. And as we know, those of us who are watching this year, we're seeing record movements of grain by the railways. So they're doing a tremendous job. So we've had a lot of success, I guess I would say, in terms of moving forward in this industry. And we've also seen, you know, various periods where things did not work so well, and very cold winters come along. And we had a combination that couldn't have been worse a few years ago, where we had a record crop well above the average, almost 50% more than we would normally move. And then suddenly a really cold winter with it, which of course made a problem for moving grain. And there were a lot of issues in terms of grain movements that happened at that time. So, you know, each year brings something a little different and new. But what we can say is that over this last 25 years, we've seen a lot of progress. And I think, if I were to put myself back 25 years when I still had a bit of color in my hair, I would never have been able to predict this is where we'd be today, because it has been such a dramatic advance. And in this role, you'll also see that we've had some very loyal sponsors over these years, and they stay with us, and it's a diverse group as well. And we're certainly very pleased and thank them for their support, because without their support, this conference would not be possible. Obviously, the Transport Institute is the #1 organizer of the Institute, and or I shouldn't say #1. We're half that. The Faculty of Agriculture is the other half of the Sol Sinclair Institute in sponsoring this. And I would also point out that there's a large team involved behind us that are working with the Asper School of Business and the people who are helping to get the information out, and they've done a fabulous job of doing that.
Barry, I put a question into the chat, and you started to talk about the history of the conference, but I wonder if you could talk about why you had it the first time. What were the issues then, and what were we worried about 25 years ago? Are we really that different?
Well, thank you. That's a good question to put forward, and I suppose the reason we had the first conference was really a function of the role of the Transport Institute. When it was created, it was envisioned as a bridge between the university and industry and government, that it was an opportunity to bring people together in a way that wasn't necessarily just easy to do, or necessarily anybody was really sponsoring. And so the Transport Institute was designed as a vehicle to try to extend the information that was generated at the university, but also to highlight the problems that were around us, and how we could try to move forward on such things. Oh, I see Minister Schuler has arrived, so let me just very quickly, we are planning, Minister, to keep our introductions very, very short, because we do have those available for anybody who wishes to read more detail. So I'm going to start off by, Minister, if you just unmute yourself, because you are muted at this time. And I would welcome the Honorable Minister Ron Schuler, the Minister of Infrastructure from Manitoba, to bring some remarks and greetings from the province. So Minister Schuler, it's over to you. There you are.
Good morning. Well, any morning where you can be introduced by Barry Prentice is a great morning. I'm going to take a moment and explain that I'm actually the president of the Barry Prentice fan club, and always pleased to be part of this conference. A, because I like the conference, but B, because I'm a fan of Barry Prentice. So very great to be here this morning. I apologize for being late. I do have a message that I would like to deliver. We are a trading province. So I represent an area called Springfield. And I love driving in spring and summer and fall. I see the crops growing on a beautiful, warm, sunny, late summer day. You can see the crops in the wind. And we realize that at best, we consume 20% of what we grow. At best, probably less than that. That means that 80% of what we grow has to go somewhere. And to even get more to the point, sometime this morning, which would have happened about 12 hours ago, there will be a little boy or little girl somewhere in the world that are going to get up and they're going to get a bowl of breakfast of some kind. And that would have come from Springfield, the Prairies, somewhere here in Canada. We helped to feed the world. So those little kids who would have probably have gone hungry, they rely on us to get it right, to get their food source to them. And maybe I'm getting a little old and a little bit more reflective in this position of mine. That is probably the most important thing about what we're talking about today, is that little kid, that little child who has no idea what Barry Prentice does, or any of us for that matter, this magnificent legislature. Hey, kid doesn't care what I do in this office. But that little child got breakfast and goes out and plays, hopefully has a great day. That's because of what we do here. So we talk about trains and planes and automobiles and semi-trucks and tonnage and all that kind of stuff, when really what we're talking about is helping to feed the world. And that is so honorable of what we do as a province and what we do as a nation. So let's bring it back to this conference. Between 10 and 12 metric tons of product are grown in this province alone. The bulk of it is shipped somewhere. A lot of it is manufactured into other foods. But what we do as this conference, whether it's myself as Minister of Infrastructure, includes transportation, or any of you online, what we have to do is we've got to get that abundance. And we've seen now lately increasingly large crops. We're doing well, we're figuring stuff out. And if we don't get it out of the farm fields, it rots, it does nobody any good. And that's where we come in. We have to ensure that there is a road for that farm truck to drive on to get it to an elevator. And then from that elevator, it's either got to go by truck or rail, bulk of it by rail. It's got to go to a port. And then somehow at the port, it's got to get onto a ship. And you guys know the rest of it, and you know it better than I do. So I'm making my tea while I'm at this. I apologize. I do want to talk to you a little bit about beyond that. We're going through a major international issue called COVID, and it's going to change the way we do things. It is going to change the market. It's going to change the way we do things even here as a province. My suggestion is this: the Department of Manitoba Infrastructure, unlike health, education, families, they're the here and now departments. Manitoba Infrastructure is all about the day after tomorrow. Trying to get people back to work. But more importantly, what if we can encourage our farmers, those individuals who grow raw materials, whether it's even mining, whether it's we have a bit of an oil patch, whatever it is. Can we look at doing some kind of a secondary or tertiary processing that we keep the jobs and the money here? Because that's where the money is, not in the raw materials. The money is in the finished product. That means that us as a department have to look at how do we help people get that product to market? Because one of the things we're learning from pandemic is everybody bunched together in a major concrete center like a city isn't necessarily the most healthy thing. And people are starting to rethink, maybe I can live a little bit more remote. I can do what I need to do and I can get it to market. I understand Raquette is on conference. I don't know if they've logged in right now, but the largest pea processing plant, I believe, in the world, in Portage la Prairie. And it is our job to ensure that there is the infrastructure in place to get that product to market. For instance, I know that there is a movement to try to move from more of a corn-based additive to a pea processed additive. Evidently, it's healthier. I don't want to get into what's healthier and not healthier. That's not the point here today. The point is that we have great opportunity with what Pratte has done. I don't know if you realize this. We're the largest potato growing province now in the country, from what I understand, because of the processing part of it. So what we have decided to do as a department, we're refocusing ourselves, is to build an east-west grid across the province that you don't have to drive very far, that you get onto a RTAC road, which is our national standard. We're spending $100 million on highway number 1 to get it back to and maintained at an RTAC standard. Very important. Highway 75, our number 1 corridor to the United States, $50 million to get it back up to an RTAC standard. The perimeter highway, probably the most important corridor because it intersects east-west with north-south trade routes. We did the safety review of the south perimeter. We've done the functional study, which is released. You can go and have a look at it. And I've also now commissioned the all the way around perimeter highway safety review. And the end goal of all of that is to take all the uncontrolled intersections off the perimeter and slowly move to it being a high-speed corridor. I would point out, the safer we make the perimeter highway, the less safe uncontrolled intersections become. And now it's going to get very serious because of the speeds, the amount of traffic, etc. And what does all that mean? It means that it shouldn't really matter where you are in Western Manitoba or Western Canada. You can easily get through Winnipeg and you can get to Highway 75 and take your product down to the US. 75, I don't know if you realize this, we've also invested a huge amount of money, and going to be, into Highway 59, which now will be RTAC from the US border all the way to Winnipeg, which gives us redundancy on Highway 75. And Highway 75 is now up to a 2009 flood standard. I would argue 97 isn't going to be real anymore. If you ever want to talk about flood mitigation, the US is spending $2.8 billion in Fargo to do the similar kind of a project which we have with the Winnipeg floodway. If they hold back anything more than 50,000 CFS, we will not be able to recreate 97 again. It would have to be far greater than that, and we hope it doesn't happen. But what we're going to do is build into it redundancy, that we always keep our trade routes open. Trade needs dependency. It must have open routes. That's what we're going to work on. Snowstorms, I'm kind of working on how to manage those, but haven't got there quite yet. So what we're planning on doing is doing a north, south, east, west grid across the province. Highway 23, almost $70 million going to be going into RTAC that. And we're working with our regional partners, our RMs, and they're coming to us as regions and telling us what the priorities are so that they can drive the economy. And that's what we need to do. All of us have to be in this together. Let us work on getting an infrastructure in place. And that's Manitoba infrastructure, right? It's big dollars. We're spending $500 million this year. Next year, we'll see what happens the year after. Think of it, in 2002, the government of the day spent about 90 million. We're spending more than 5 times that. And we are upgrading as many of our roads to create that grid to get the product to market, which includes the perimeter highway, because you have to get to Highway 75. And if you want to take your product going east, the South Perimeter Highway, even the north would work for that. So I just want to make sure I got through all my points. As you can tell, this is a passion of mine. As the president of the Barry Prentice fan club, he's done a great job on me ensuring that I have a passion and a love for transportation. We've done a lot of great things, and I've probably come to the end of my time. I haven't seen a Barry coming on and giving me the time to shut it down. Pleased to be a partner, as always. And if ever you wanted to have a conversation on how our highway and bridge infrastructure program intersects with our flood mitigation project, I'm also the Minister of Emergency Measures. I am responsible for all the flood mitigation, and we're trying to bring all that together so that there's always a predictability, that you always have a way to get your product to market. working on JIT right now, which most of the world is, we don't have the luxury of people being able to store their product for a month or 2 or 3. That's just not on. It's got to be manufactured, whatever it's done, and it's got to get to the market. It's got to get to where it's going to go. You have a department and you have a government from the premier, and I've had this conversation with the premier, probably not quite as much time, but I made it a little shorter when I talked to him. From the premier to this government to this ministry, that's what we're committed to. Keeping in mind, safety is always their number one priority. Absolutely. And then it's going to be return on investment. And we believe that a grid across this province of RTAC roads, we're not going A1 anymore. Now we're going to go to an RTAC standard that you can get your product to market safely, reliably. And we want to drive a prosperous and a wealthy Manitoba. We're going to come out of COVID. Manitoba Infrastructure is the department of the day after tomorrow. And I can tell you that from the deputy ministers to our assistant deputy ministers on down, we're on board. Premier agrees that we are the department of the day after tomorrow. We're going to be ready for it, and we have a plan in place. Dr. Prentice, always great being at your conference. Wish it was in person. I'd love to give you a really big handshake, and thank you for everything you do to help make this the great province as it is. Premier always ends his speeches, so I'm going to steal his line. Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So Premier always says, the only thing better than today in Manitoba is going to be tomorrow. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those inspiring words. And indeed, it's certainly true. You know, firms that look at where they're going to locate a facility or a plant, they're going to be looking to say, well, what's the transportation like? And can I get my product out as I hope to on a regular basis? And it's a really important part of our economy in terms of the guarantee and the comfort to firms that if they invest in this province, they will be able to succeed. So thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate it. And certainly I'm going to do the best to make sure that you remain a member of the Barry Prentice Fan Club. Thank you so much again for joining us this morning. With that, I would now like to turn the program over to the first chair of the morning. The first chair is Steve Pratte. He's the policy manager of the Canadian Canola Growers Association. And without further introduction, Steve, I'll turn it over to you, except to say one thing. Steve is also one of the industry members of our advisory group that helps to put together the Fields on Wheels. So I thank you for that as well, Steve.
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, so good morning, everyone, and great to see some familiar faces, or rather some familiar names in the participant list. So this morning, we'll just jump right into it. We have to 10:30 for our session number 1. And this session will explore several topics under the theme of climate change and processing resiliency. And really, this panel will provide us some interesting baseline thinking to start our day. As we know, agriculture in Western Canada has been characterized by some as an outdoor sport. And despite the impressive ongoing evolution and achievements in crop production technologies, techniques, and understanding, as we move into the future, we can't escape the fundamentals of weather, climate trends, and their medium and longer term impacts on our soil health, availability of moisture, our sustained productivity, et cetera. So as such, we're going to begin this session with Dr. Danny Blair from the University of Winnipeg, and he's going to explore the topics of changing growing conditions on the prairies and leave us to consider the implications of some projections and modeling that what those projections may have on our sector. Secondly, Dr. Graham Parsons, the president of the Organization for Western Economic Cooperation, will speak to the issue of water on the prairies and strategic issues surrounding irrigation and sustainability of agri-food economies. And lastly, we'll close out our session with Margo Jarvis Redelback, executive director of the Alberta Irrigation Districts Association, and we'll build on the elements of the above, highlighting the specific example of irrigation in Alberta, linking together the issues of farmers, food, and climate adaptation. So we'll have the 3 panelists give their presentations in succession, and then we'll use the balance of our time for question, answers, and discussion. And as we have this online format, and with the number of participants we have, please put your comments or thoughts into the chat function located at the bottom of your Zoom interface screen. I'll monitor them during the session, and we'll use them to facilitate the discussion with our panelists at the end with the time we have remaining. So with that, let us begin our first presentation. So first up will be Dr. Danny Blair with the presentation, Changing Growing Conditions, Hotter, Drier, Wetter, Colder. Danny Blair is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Winnipeg, where he's been working since 1987. He's also a co-director of the Prairie Climate, which is one of Canada's primary climate information portals. At the center, he leads the team that produces the high-quality data, products, and visualizations of climate projections for the Climate Atlas of Canada. And I'm going to note that according to my skimming of our archives, Danny last presented at the 18th Annual Field on Wheels in 2013. So welcome back, Danny, and the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I too am a big fan of Barry Prentice. Barry, thank you once again for inviting me to be a part of this conference. It's always very interesting and always very important. So thank you very much. And I can't believe you didn't talk about airships during the time that you had some time to kill. So my talk is about changing growing conditions, hotter, drier, wetter, colder. And here's the answer. Hotter, absolutely. Drier, sometimes. Wetter, generally. And colder, well, not very often, especially in the long term. I could end there, but I'll elaborate a little bit. So as all of you know, there are some benefits to climate change and some threats from climate change. Some benefits I've listed here, more carbon dioxide. More carbon dioxide as fertilizer for plants, of course. Longer growing season, I'll elaborate on that a little bit in a little while. Absolutely, the growing season is much longer than it was 100 years ago, and it's going to get much longer throughout the rest of this century. More growing degree days for growing corn and other heat-loving plants. More excessive heat, unfortunately, goes along with that, and that obviously is a threat to agriculture from climate change. More precipitation. Generally, the amount of precipitation that would be received in this grain-growing region will be higher, but there are some caveats to that. One of them is that there's a greater risk of excessive moisture at times, and at the same time, more drought risk. And of course, along with the extra heat and the longer growing season comes a greater risk of pest, disease, and invasive species, unfortunately. And then the thing that's really interesting to me as a climatologist and worrisome to a lot of people, as has already been noted, is more variability in extremes. The agricultural sector always deals with variability, but the climate models tell us that there's even more coming in the future. As you might know, just a couple of days ago, the Government of Canada released its Prairie chapter for the latest national assessment. And not surprisingly, it has come to the same conclusions that I have just summarized there, and that there are benefits and threats to agriculture. So I encourage you to go and read this document. It's online. The link is at the bottom there, changeclimate.ca. These links will be active when I share my PDF with the participants, if that's going to happen. So kudos to the Government of Canada for getting that out. So has the climate changed? You bet it has. So here's some monthly trends. Usually we look at seasonal trends, but those seasonal trends tend to mask some important trends at the sub-season level. So here I've made some maps from NRCan's daily grid of data for 1970 to 2017. And the reds are areas of Canada in that month that have been getting warmer, and the blues are actually colder. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the 1970 to 2017, those 48, pardon me, those 48 years, you actually see some cooling trends in the prairies. In particular, notice May, there's a lot of blue there. And as there is in June in the southern prairies here, there's actually been a cooling trend. Now, is it a statistically significant trend? No, I have some other maps to show the level of significance, and most of these cooler trends are not significant, but they're not positive. And so, I find that fascinating. But of course, in the winter months, January and December in particular, we've seen it across Canada, and including our part of the world, a really dramatic rise in temperatures over those 48 years. And that's going to continue in the next 48 years as well. I have to point out, notice that the northern part of Canada is red at all times of the year The Arctic is warming at about 3 times the global rate. Canada as a whole, when you average it all together, about double. This is maximum temperature, and this is minimum temperature. The minimum temperatures have warmed up more so than the maximum temperatures. I'm just gonna flip back and forth here. There's the maximums and there's the minimums. And if you look carefully, the minimums are higher trends, stronger trends, and those cooling trends in those early summer months largely disappear when you look at the minimum temperatures. And in any case, this data set from NRCan, this daily gridded data is a fascinating data set. It only goes up to 2017 because they're understaffed and it takes a long time to clean that data. Speaking of data, I'm sure many of you are aware of the Prairie Climate Centre's Climate Atlas of Canada at climateatlas.ca. As was mentioned, I'm the co-director, one of the co-directors with Nora Casson and our executive director, Ian Morrow, who have produced this fantastic, what we think is a fantastic product that puts data relevant to people into their hands all across Canada. That is, no matter where you are in Canada, you can click on the map and we'll show you what the climate models project for your part of the world. There's nothing like it anywhere else, and so we're very proud of it. And of course, I have to thank our primary sponsor for this, and that is the Government of Canada. When you zoom into the map, you can click on lots of little towns and cities across the prairies, or any of those grid squares. And here I've clicked on Brandon. I'm going to highlight Brandon here a little bit in the heart of our grain growing region. Here I'm looking at the maximum temperatures in July in Brandon. And on the side there, you see a graph that, an interactive graph actually, if you do this online. And you can see the change in temperatures from 1950 to 2095. And if I go in even further, I can get a report for Brandon or any of these thousands of places across this map, a little summer report for 2 carbon scenarios, the high carbon scenario and the low carbon scenario. In my presentation, I'm going to highlight the high carbon scenario. Let's hope we don't follow the high carbon scenario, but we're pretty much on track following that. But there are some good signs out there, thankfully. And so there, you can produce a nice little simple summer report, or you can really deep dive into the data. You can download the data as shown here. You can download a CSV with all the model data, all the 24 models and the ensemble of the model. You can download the historical data from 1950 to 2005. You can download a high resolution version of the image for your own presentations. So lots of data is available from the site. And here's an example of that. Here's the mean winter temperature in Brandon under the high carbon scenario again. And it shows from the 30-year period of 1976 to 2005 to the 30-year period of 2051 to 2080. The mean winter temperature is projected to increase as an average of those 24 models by almost 6 degrees. So there's a lot of warming has already occurred in our winter, and there's a lot more to come. This is the thing we're most confident about with climate change, and that is the temperatures. And the summer season, of course, is so important to agriculture. It's not projected to warm up quite as much, but a 4.5 degrees from 1976 to 2005 to 2051 to 2080, that's a lot of warming. And that produces, of course, a much longer growing season or frost-free season. And here's what's projected for that. From 1976 to 2005 to 2051 to 2080, those 2 30-year periods, we're looking at over a month of extra frost-free season. And that on top of already a much longer frost-free season that we've already are already enjoying. And so that pretty much accounts for a lot of the benefits from climate change, but unfortunately there are lots of negatives. Here are some maps of the monthly temperature changes. I'll skip over this fairly quickly here, but as you can see that all the tones on the map are positive. This is the mean temperature, not the max or the mins. They're all positive, and especially in the north of Canada. And here's a deep dive down into that. So you can, on the site, you can average out the temperature changes or the precipitations for every province and territory. Here, I produced a graph of the average monthly temperature, mean temperature for Manitoba from 1950 to 2095. And this is using 1976 to 2005 as the average. And as you can see, we're on a track in each month to having much warmer temperatures throughout the rest of the century. And in fact, these lines right here are December and November. We're looking at near the end of the century, 10 degrees warmer in November and December than it was in 1976 to 2005. And if I use 1951 to 1980 as the baseline, we're looking at almost 11 degrees warmer in December. And generally in the other months, we're looking at the growing season months, we're looking at 6, 7, 8 degrees warmer in those growing season months by the end of the century. A transformation of our climate is underway. And again, I'm highlighting the high carbon scenario here, but even under the low carbon scenario, which I hope we follow to some degree, it's going to be much warmer, projected to be much warmer. Speaking of much warmer, we're expected to have a lot of heat in the prairies. This is one of the things that's really highlighted on the climate atlas, and that is that the prairies are going to see a lot of hot days. And by a hot day, we mean plus 30 degrees Celsius or higher. Here's a map of how many plus 30 degree days we're projecting to have from those models near the end of the century. But if I look at the change, we're looking at a very large increase in the number of hot days. Winnipeg, for example, goes from 12 to about over 50 and almost 60 plus 30 degree days by the end of the century. And that, of course, it should be of interest to farmers. Here's another way to project that. Here I'm looking at the 10-year moving average of under the high carbon scenario of the number of summers in the future that will be warmer than the warmest summer of the last 60 years or so. And you can see that near the end of the century, 80% of the summers will be warmer than the summers that we've had since the 1950s. And so that, again, is a transformation of our ag climate. Precipitation, of course, is really important to the ag climate as well. And generally, we're expecting it to be wetter, but some caveats. So all those greens and blues there indicate wetter, the blues in particular. And I'm just going to move forward here to keep things going. Here's the far future 2051 to 2080 projection of change in precipitation. And we're looking at some pretty important changes in precipitation, increases in precipitation in April. That's the month that sees the largest increase in precipitation in the prairies. But brown in July and August. And that's of concern to agriculture, of course. But I will elaborate on that in a second here. And I'm just going to skip that scat. So for Brandon, here's for 2021 to 2050, the next 30 years, we're already almost in this period. It's in those summer months where we're looking at a fairly high probability of less precipitation. This is the percent that this is the probability that the precipitation will decrease. So a lot of those models indicate a decline in precipitation in the next 30 years in July and August. And if we continue to, if I try to continue to 2050, whoop, went too far, 2051 to 2080, a level of agreement amongst models indicates that July and August will be drier. At the same time, that almost certainly it's going to be a lot hotter. And that is why we suspect that the risk of drought is going to increase as we go forward in time. And indeed, another way to portray this, and here I'm looking at Edmonton, Saskatoon, and Brandon, for 2051 to 2080, the far future, under the high carbon scenario, we're looking at a decrease in precipitation by about 5% or maybe even 10% at Brandon in those important grain growing or crop growing seasons, months. So at the same time that it's projected to get wetter, especially in the spring and winter, the summers more often will be drier than they are right now. And so the key message here is that, or one of the key messages is that variability in extremes will become more frequent, even more so than already the case in our crazy climate. Extended rainfalls, intense rainfalls, erosion inducing rainfalls, early snowfalls, as we saw last year, hailstorms, we've certainly seen that, especially in the Western prairies, flood and drought in the same year, we've seen that in Manitoba, windstorms, grass fires, heat waves, and then the dreaded polar vortex, which any day now might bite us. There's a lot of variability in our climate already, and with an energized climate system, we're expected to get even more energized. And I'll finish or almost finish off with the graph of global temperature. We're on track to having a much warmer climate. There's no turning back, but there is turning down. Let's hope we turn the curve down a little bit by really getting serious about our carbon emissions. There's some very good signs out there, but climate change is in our future, and a change to our agroclimate is in our future. And as all of you know, it impacts everything about our society, about our activity in the prairies here. If we want to continue to feed those little boys and those little girls around the world, if we want to continue to be the breadbasket for the world, we need to deal with this problem. There are some serious threats on the horizon and already here. And so we need to really get into this. And again, there are some really good signs that adaptation is being taken very seriously by the ag community. And as has been mentioned by Barry and others, we really need to get serious about our water management. It's going to become an even more urgent issue in the future. We need to expand and promote and fund innovation. And one way we can do that is providing data and advice. And just a shout out here, we try to do that at the Prairie Climate Center. And then here is something new that's coming in the new year, Climate West. There is a Prairie Climate Hub coming in the new year. It's an amalgamation or a project from the Prairie Climate Center, Park at the University of Regina, Dave Sachin's shop, and our friends at ISD in Winnipeg here. We are working together with funding from the federal government and the provincial governments, the 3 provincial governments, to put data and advice and expertise in people's hands. And so I hope you watch for that in the new year. There are, as I say, there are some really good signs out there. I'm very proud that CAP used our data from the Prairie Climate Center in this report about ag solutions to climate change. And on our website at the Prairie Climate Center, there are some great videos. Ian Morrow and his team are great videographers, great movie makers. And there are lots of little videos that are related to agriculture. There's one called Farming Carbon that is just fascinating. And there's an elderly farmer, Roy McLaren from southwestern Manitoba, that talks about the importance of climate change in agriculture. And I encourage you to look at those. So with that, I thank you, Barry. Thank you and everybody for listening. I look forward to any questions that might arise at the end of my session or end of our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Interesting. And I think our next 2 panelists are really going to build off of what Danny's described as far as the work that he and his colleagues have been doing at the center. So moving on to our second presenter is Dr. Graham Parsons with a presentation entitled 21st Century Water Wealth, Prairie Water, Irrigation, and Sustainable Agri-Food Economies in a Changing World. Very briefly here, Graham Parsons is a PhD economist trained in regional economic development and environmental economics at the University College London in the UK. He taught at the Universities of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Regina. For over 40 years, Graham practiced economic, environmental, urban, rural, agricultural, community, and transport development as an academic, a senior public servant in federal and provincial governments, consultant to industry, and a trusted advisor to governments, international development agencies, corporations, and farmers. And the first chief economist for Western Canada. He was the first chief economist for Western Canada for the Canada West Foundation. Again, I just skimming the archives last evening. I'll note that Graham presented at the 3rd Field on Wheels in 1998 and last presented at the 20th annual Fields on Wheels in 2015. And hopefully, as your frequency of presentations is shortening, perhaps we'll see you at number 28 or 29. So Graham, welcome, and the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, hopefully I hope to build on this theme. It is Christmas and ho, 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 but we need to look forward to next year and the years beyond. And there are 2 major water development projects in Saskatchewan that are major new environmental platforms for adapting to this new world. And what I want to talk to you about is a little about where they came from and where they can go. I want to start first of all with a little history. Prairie Canada has a history of succeeding in spite of seemingly impossible odds on climate-related issues. The two cases are obviously the Palliser expedition, where Palliser comes and tells us not to settle, and secondly, responding to the droughts. What we often forget is these both lay the foundations for 21st century irrigation economics. Palliser comes, the Parliament in London tells him to come and see whether we can live in these areas. And he comes across the prairies, finds it very dry, annual water deficits, we've known this before. And basically, whilst there's lots of buffalo, he can't see how settlers can come and farm this land. So he says no. But what does he know? Look at the Victorian transportation and agricultural sciences that come to the rescue. Steamships, pretty new at the time, bring people to the land of opportunity. Railroads join the prairies to the markets. Grain elevators, with their brilliant Victorian engineering design, store the grain, keep it dry, and get it ready to go on the trains. Oxen and steam engines clear the land, immigrants learn to be farmers, and Dominion farms teach modern farming practices as best we know at the time, including summer fallow in drylands. And they leave a legacy for Canada's future that became known as the breadbasket to the world. What's really interesting, though, is the foundation that was established in those years, where the prairies had 62% of the share of all Canadian farm acres. Saskatchewan had 30%. It carries on to today, where we've still got 82% and 40% in those two, in the Prairie and Saskatchewan categories. So we laid the foundations for agriculture for the country at that time. And we did that by taking the best agronomic information at the time, applying it to dryland agriculture, and we succeeded very well, and we had good crops. It was also the start of irrigation in many areas. Initially, it was pretty simple. It was literally ponding the spring runoff, mainly for hay. But in some cases, like the CPR building across the country, they've been given land, remember, to build the railway and to sell. Well, they couldn't sell these dry lands, so they started to build aqueducts, bring the water to the land could then bloom, and they could sell the land, and by selling the land, they then had the basis to actually pay for the rest of the railroad. And then the second case that we shouldn't forget is the dirty 30s. It was an environmental and a human disaster. The land literally blew away. Farming was lost. Farmers left. Unemployment was widespread. Riots, municipalities go bankrupt. And there's a response. The response in the second case here is in fact the creation of PFRA, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, to bring the very best science and technology of the day to work on new agricultural science and technology that can work in these drylands. But it also lays the foundation for irrigation and water management. They build reservoirs, they teach irrigation, they work with communities, they develop shelter belts and new crops. They are adapting in a real sense to what is probably the worst climate issue that we've ever had. And this was in fact the best adaptation agency the world has ever seen. But they re-established literally the export grain economy, and the foundations are laid for a larger irrigation economy. They also bring one big visionary concept, which is the South Saskatchewan River Project. It's a simple concept. Here is the Palliser Triangle. And right at the heart of that drought and the big bend in the South Saskatchewan River was where the drought was. And it was a disaster in Saskatchewan. So the concept they came up with was simple. Build two dams, the Gardner Dam in the north, Capel Dam in the south, and create a 225-kilometer lake. We know it as Lake Diefenbaker today. And when you have the water, you can distribute it. You can distribute it for agriculture, you can distribute it for mining, you can distribute it for municipalities. And if you've got the water, then you can irrigate in big blocks. And as a result of building that infrastructure, you can start to irrigate. And if you irrigate, there will be lots of benefits: yields, production, energy, ag value added, municipal water supplies, drought security. You've got sustainable rural futures where people can live and thrive. Well, the potential for Lake Diefenbaker was never realized. There are around 1 million acres around the lake that could be developed, but only 100,000 were ever developed. Most of the acres on the west side were never developed. The east side was developed to a degree, but there was land all the way from North Battleford down to Swift Current that could be worked. So the original vision from the 1940s and 50s as a meaningful response to the droughts of the 30s remained, but it was never fully realized. In fact, canals were built and left to fill up. Trees grew in the canals. They were never used. Public monies that had been spent on the infrastructure was essentially wasted. But now here we are in 2020, after years of study, 2 large Saskatchewan irrigation projects that have always been part of the South Saskatchewan River Project are now in development using the waters from Lake Diefenbaker. The first one essentially is the Upper Capel conveyance. Well, it's not the first, it's the second, but nonetheless. This is Lake Diefenbaker, and down along a 95-kilometer distribution system into Buffalo Pound Lake, you then create a new piece of infrastructure, and as a result, you can irrigate 100,000 acres in the uplands. The second part is on the west side that was never developed. It's the one that was started but never finished, never got close to being finished. And basically, this is moving Lake Diefenbaker waters up through the dryland farming west of Saskatoon to Conquest and Rosetown. And you can go all the way up to North Battleford up here. And it could be designed as a 2-way flow system, increasing flood management capacities on the North and the South Saskatchewan rivers. But there's another 400,000 to 500,000 acres here. An economic analysis on all of these big projects shows a lot of big numbers. In numbers on investment, the 2 projects are about $4 billion. GDP goes up, fiscal returns go up, lots of labor income, governments get their money, employment, 30,000 perhaps. Big, big numbers. But I don't really want to focus on those today, because I think there are bigger issues that should be thought about when we think about adaptation to the future warming that's just been described. Irrigation is more than just statistics. There is a much, much bigger picture. Now, at core, irrigation is a farm investment and productivity project, leading to higher financial returns per acre, with crops each year, less accumulated debt for individual farmers because they get a return each year. They can grow and sell higher value-added crops with secure water supplies. And all of this leads to higher farm incomes. This little chart on the right is interesting. Any of these numbers over 1 in this little chart show that basically irrigation is far more productive than dryland farming. It's true for the basic wheat, barley, canola, grains and oilseeds that we've ever produced, but it's also true for a lot of other products that we can grow. So in time, the irrigation infrastructure is far more transformative than just on the farm alone, because also the environment, the society, the economy, and the very future of Saskatchewan and Canada are affected. Just look at this distribution of $3.6 billion of economic benefits from irrigated agriculture in Alberta. Only 10% go to end up in agriculture. Ag processing, 47%. That's the food processing in Alberta. It's the sugar beets. It's a whole load of food processing activities. It can be potatoes. It can be, there are many, many. But then there are the forward and backward linkages. from supplying the equipment, building the canals, developing all of the pipelines. And then there's a little piece at the top, which is important. These are the recreation, the wetland, the tourism benefits that occur out of an irrigated economy and society. Irrigation and crop diversity does equal higher net farm incomes. You grow higher quality crops, you grow higher value crops, you get higher yields, and you don't have crop failures. That means reliable, high quality volumes. That is what food processors look for. Now, if you're selling to local food processors, you're also delivering local rather than distance. And lower transportation costs equals higher farm incomes. You don't have to take it 1,000 miles to the coast on the train, then getting all the way across the ship, in a ship to Asia, and so on at the other end. Ultimately, that's all reflected in the price. When you're delivering locally, you take it down the street for maybe 20 or 30 miles, and that's it. And you can be producing potatoes into frozen potatoes, sunflower seeds, the list is long. And the new processing crops like Pratte here, near Prairies, Prairie, in construction, multi-million-dollar investments in a rural economy. And these are peas, faba beans, all going into pre-processing facilities. And what are they producing? Veggie burgers for the world. Now, some of the benefits of this substantial processing and development activity from irrigation are also seen in the population numbers for rural communities. Here are the population changes on the east and the west side of Lake Diefenbaker between an early period when there was no irrigation on the east or the west side, that is between 1921 and 1951. And you can see here, the west side in orange, no irrigation, the east side, no irrigation, they both decline. But by the later period, 1951 to 2006, irrigation starts up. The west side with no irrigation continues its decline. On the right in red, on the east side, you can see the population changes and grows. It's from reliable yields, it's from the irrigation investment, it's from the value-added activities. It leads to municipal growth, employment and services. An outlook, a small irrigation center on the east side is in fact a very healthy small rural community. But irrigation is also a substantial adaptation to global warming. There are huge water savings in large irrigation schemes and on the farm. And we often like to think of irrigation using these huge amounts of water, but we forget just how much it saves and can preserve in particularly dry times. Here are some of the potential savings from the large irrigation systems in southern Alberta now being looked at, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot more detail on this in the subsequent speaker. They're converting canals to pipelines. That means evaporation and seepage savings, over 100,000 acre feet each year. Precision water measurement and management allows for far better uses of those waters. When you have deeper storage, you lose less from evaporation. And there's an ability in these projects to actually reclaim 60,000 acres for irrigation. These are big numbers. And that's from the water systems. But that same process is going on the farm with water conservation. Historically, we had a lot of flood irrigation. And then we moved towards leveled surface and hand moved and wheel rolled irrigation systems, then the high pivots, then the drop pivots. All of these moving through the systems to eventually drip irrigation save as much as 90%. Drip irrigation is 90% efficient compared to up in the floods where you're lucky if you can get 30. So Precision agriculture is also coming and is also built into more efficient water delivery systems. Down here on the left side of this chart is what I just talked about on the previous slide. I won't go through it again. But when we think about water supplies, if they can be measured and delivered to more closely meet the moisture requirements of plant growth and soil moisture, we get some huge benefits. Because we can then supplement the water supplies with nutrients at the right levels to closely meet the needs of the plant. There's a soluble delivery of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. We can also measure and monitor the plants, the soils. We can map it. We can look at the nutrient testing, the water holding capacities, and the end result of all of this precision agriculture is 77% reductions in lower energy costs, and in many cases, that also means lower carbon emissions, 50–60% less equipment use, irrigation water use, fertilizer and herbicide loss, herbicides. That's big money that contributes to higher farm incomes, and then higher crop yields and quality. In the South Saskatchewan system, a system-wide water management network in wet and dry years, which we know are coming, are really significant. There are basically two elements here. There are the storage reservoirs, whether they're large lakes like Diefenbaker, smaller storage ponds, balancing reservoirs, wetlands, and then there are the water distribution networks. Now take these two together and work them as a system, and they can start to provide storage for both drought and flood. It's an essential, practical, realistic response to global warming that in fact has been used for centuries around the world. So an irrigation network can store water in distribution networks, surface reservoirs, balancing reservoirs, and wetlands. It creates movement options in Saskatchewan from the South and the North Saskatchewan rivers, which increase the water security over much larger areas. It provides additional sustainable water storage options in aquifers as well. It can interconnect with the rural systems. It stops huge billion-dollar payments to dryland farming every time we have a drought, and that can only get higher if we keep having more droughts. And then it's essential for communities, industries, value-added processing, and the natural environment. It gives a fundamental foundation that is secure. And that's where investment comes. But if we can produce all this food, are there markets for it? Well, in spite of the pandemic, the global realities are still for more people, more in need of food, more children to feed, perhaps an extra 2 billion. We are seeing around the world improved global incomes. That means changing diets, more meat, more veggie burgers though as well. But we should keep in mind that while this is going on, agricultural lands around the world are being lost to urbanization. China lost 25% of its best agricultural lands in 10 years with its huge growth. Then global warming has a direct effect on agricultural production, particularly where rising sea levels are flooding the deltas from the most productive agriculture in the world, which often gets 3 crops a year. I won't dwell on this because it's just been dealt with in really good fashion. But generally, it is a warming planet. The temperatures are going up. And there are consequences of that in our ability to feed the world. In many areas, reduced yields will come from crops and livestock in the higher temperatures and the extreme weather events, droughts, floods, and storms. Rain-fed agriculture is no longer as reliable as it has been. Production will be lost. We know we're losing the deltas. We know that arable lands are being lost to urbanization. Crop losses are coming for pests and insects. New York Times reported earlier this year that instead of coronavirus, the hunger will kill us, a global food crisis looms. So lower levels of global food production have clear consequences for humanity at scales of emergency well beyond those experienced in the 20th century. Well, Palliser came and said it was dry. It was, and it is, and it will be. Periodic drought will get warmer, but we shouldn't forget the realities. We are, regardless, in a prairie moisture deficit. Right across the prairies, we lose more to evaporation than we get from the other sources. Maybe that'll change a little with global warming. We do get droughts. This is 2017, but there are other years where it will come and it'll be different. We're not very good at predicting them in great detail, but they come and they keep coming. And Dave Sochin in Regina suggests that maybe they'll be 10 years long. That'll be an interesting scenario to work with. But there's also upside on the agronomic side. More heat units, higher yields, 5 to 30%, faster growth with the increased carbon content, a longer growing season, increased vulnerabilities though to pests and infections, and more opportunities for crop diversification. Agriculture Canada say the largest yield gains will occur in water-stressed regions, such as the Canadian prairies, due to improved water use efficiency and with the elevated carbon dioxide levels. But what's the key piece for this? Well, the essential requirement is to thrive in this new prairie climate is going to be water security. Well, what can we grow if we can grow the food? And the thing is that it's kind of amazing that when you look at what is possible and you look at the major Canadian and prairie vegetable imports, for example, for 2019, Canada imports are the top 10, the top vegetable imports. Yeah, vegetable imports is about $4 billion each year. In the prairies, we're importing about 600 million each year. Interesting. Here they are, they're broccoli, they're tomatoes, they're onions, all of the things that we grow already as field crops and greenhouse crops. We can already grow them if we have secure supplies of water. And one of the bigger pictures from irrigation is not just the question of the growing, but it's also the technology and the science that goes around it. And we have a bright future, in fact, in irrigation technology. Some of the best centers in the world are right here in the prairies. They're the people who train people around the world, who do research around the world, and they're leading solar panels, they're leading in all sorts of areas that are really exactly the technologies that the world needs to be able to complete and maintain its own agriculture expansions as well. So prairie-led irrigation science networks can help with the transition at home and fight drought with new and water irrigation technologies abroad. And here's another major issue that doesn't get talked about too much. This is Canada. And here are some of our images of Canada from coast to coast to coast to coast. And yes, there are a few people who live in Toronto in big cities and other big cities. I'm in Calgary, you're in Winnipeg, these are the big cities. But outside of it, there's a big piece that's missing, and it's these landscapes. The landscapes are the prairie landscapes, which are part of that essential, quintessential Canadian identity. And who looks after this quintessential Canadian identity? Oh, the stewards of most of the southern lands are farmers. Irrigation farmers not only crop the land, but they also strengthen, develop, and improve the soils. They create the wetlands for wildlife. Most of the big wetlands in the prairies are fed by irrigation systems. The essential features of Canada's landscapes are maintained with water systems that protect against drought and improve security against floods. It's an essential Canadian landscape and a waterscape for city and rural folk to enjoy as Canadians. It's a contribution to Canada too easily forgotten and taken for granted. And then there are the platforms that occur in Saskatchewan's economic growth, for example. I'll use an example. In the early years that you saw earlier on, it was basically wheat and barley and oats and those basic grains. And that was fine until we had the dirty 30s and we developed some other crops, canola, livestock, and we developed a bigger economy in Saskatchewan. After that, the economy in Saskatchewan supplemented with oil, gas, uranium, potash, all of these things made it a bigger economy. And often we got hooked on what I call the sort of the cocaine of the fiscal revenues that come from mineral natural resources. Governments very easily get hooked on them. Well, as we look ahead into the 21st century, we can introduce irrigation and food processing as a separate platform into the economy, a significant one. And by building the infrastructure, we can then also develop the processing. And in Saskatchewan, there's at least 2 million acres that could get developed. And probably there's plenty of water for it as well. At the present time, we're just working on these top pieces, but nonetheless, there's room for more. And with the expansion of each of these irrigation developments comes a value chain. They're all different. Here's one tied to irrigated crops, livestock, pet foods, pharmaceuticals. The returns from the value-added activities are huge vis-a-vis just the returns from the farming. And I'll move towards the question of the conference, because the conference has always been fields on wheels. Or is it wheels in fields? Because if you know irrigation, it's the wheels that move the irrigation pivots around. Or with the old and new transportation coming and the new crops, there is new infrastructure that's going to be required. New infrastructure in particular for refrigerated movements from wheels in fields to fields on wheels to no wheels in fields. The technology for refrigeration is ancient in many respects. But with this new world of more vegetables, with more processing, there needs to be not just roads, but also warehousing, storage, abilities for containers to move in planes, on ships, and then even in airships. Yes, Barry, your airships are in this presentation. But with airships, whilst we can deliver food aid in Africa, we don't seem to have the moxie in the country to work out the regulations to allow us to deliver foods to the north, where our children have the most expensive food requirements in the world in terms of prices. Why wouldn't we be using them? Now, the current social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively are currently stalling prairie transformative growth. We've got the triple threat at the moment. It's social, environmental, economic. It's COVID-led. It's the investment collapse around oil, and it's climate change altogether. Regina is just an empty street. Will this never end? Good grief, is our future to be predetermined, just like the witches at the beginning of Macbeth? Can nothing be done? We must do something, or do we just sit on the bench with Charlie Brown and worry about it? Well, prairie economic recovery with irrigation can have a higher purpose. It's so much more than just public irrigation investment on the farm. It's recovery, it's a sensible recovery from a pandemic recession. Rather than just paying people to stay at home, use those billions of dollars and invest in something that will last for a future. It's investment replacement and recovery. It's foreign food import replacement to make a stronger country, more sustainable country. It's adapting to global warming in a real sense. Rather than just studying it indefinitely, we need to get on and respond, just as we did in the 30s. In the 30s, remember, the worst droughts you could possibly imagine. And yet, within a course of about certainly 6 years, we got ourselves back on the horse again. We can adapt to global warming. We need these sustainable technologies for the planet, not just for the prairies. We all need improved water securities. We need sustainable growing rural communities. We don't all need to live in the big cities. And we should be looking after our lands and environment. I think it's high time to irrigate. But we can turn prairie limitations with respect to what are seen as problems into a good future. We realize the irrigation development potential that's available. We can complete the unfinished South Saskatchewan River projects. We can capture the secondary benefits, and we can build a diversified, world-class prairie agri-food and energy economy. And in doing so, we get all of those economic benefits. We become a world-class prairie center for doing these sorts of activities around the world. We restore investment and economic activity, and we generate sustainable Canadian economic growth. So if you look at this as a Prairie and Canada recovery strategy, there were setbacks on this prairie journey, particularly in those early years from Palliser in the 30s, but resilience, perseverance, science and technology prevailed. It's a large strategy to replace and expand on the investment and economic losses of recent years. And the prairies have faced these challenges before. They recover, and like the phoenix, they arise again and again and again, and we can do it again. But maybe it's time to do it again starting now. Thank you for listening. Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Dr. Parsons, for that thought-provoking survey of this issue. And I think, again, I'm really pleased with the organization of this panel. And I think when we get to our question and answer amongst the panelists and with the participants, we've got to a lot to unpack and to digest here. So again, thank you for that. We'll move on to our third presentation, our final one for this session. And our final presenter is going to be Margo Jarvis Redelback with a presentation titled Alberta Irrigation, Farmers, Food, and Climate Adaptation. Margo is a registered professional agrologist, and she's worked in various natural resource sectors within Saskatchewan, British Columbia, and Alberta on management projects involving wildlife, vegetation, forestry, and irrigation. Margo worked at the Eastern Irrigation District for many years, while she had the pleasure of directly assisting producers with wildlife habitat initiatives, irrigation development projects, and on-farm efficiency conversion projects, while at the same time promoting the benefits of these activities to the general public. In her current role as Executive Director of the Alberta Irrigation Districts Association, she continues to represent Alberta's irrigation sector by actively promoting the value of irrigation to the province of Alberta. Margo and her family live on and operate a third-generation irrigated crop farm just outside of Brooks, Alberta. So Margo, welcome, and the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm very happy to be here this morning. As you mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the Alberta Irrigation Districts Association. That association represents Alberta's 13 irrigation districts on matters of mutual interest, including education and outreach. And I do live just outside of Brooks, Alberta. I am coming to you from there this morning. And interestingly enough, in Dr. Parsons' presentation just before me, he did mention the Brooks Aqueduct, and my farm is actually located right adjacent to the aqueduct, and I wake up to this historic engineering feat every morning. So this morning, I'm going to give you a little bit about the Alberta perspective to irrigation. I'm going to start with just giving a background on Alberta irrigation, as I recognize that not everyone at this conference may have a good background and understanding of irrigation here. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit of the social and economic importance of irrigation to the province and the country. And I'm going to wrap up with discussing some of our sector adaptations to a changing climate through water conservation, efficiency, and productivity. So the development and management of irrigation in Alberta really began about 140 years ago. It was during early settlement in the late 1870s that farmers were quick to realize the benefits and need of irrigation to stabilize and increase crop production. And it was during this time that some small-scale projects developed off the Sheep River, Fish Creek, and Lee Creek by very small private interests. Now, about this time, William Pierce, a federal government resource management official, realized that irrigated agriculture would be a key factor in stimulating settlement on the arid Canadian prairies, particularly in that region identified as the Palliser Triangle. The development of the Northwest Irrigation Act in 1894 moved the Dominion of Canada away from British common law riparian rights and supported large-scale irrigation on the prairies, by allowing water diversions to non-riparian lands. The act was quite progressive in its day and made Canadian water management distinct from other regions in North America. And the result of this approach has provided Alberta with a system where collaboration rather than litigation prevails when water management issues or concerns arise. So the Galt family had interests in Southern Alberta coal mining and rail transportation, and they were really the first organization in Southern Alberta to take a step towards large-scale irrigation development. And they focused on diverting water from the St. Mary River system. The Galts were assisted in this endeavor by the Mormon community in Lee Creek that had demonstrated years earlier the benefits of irrigation. The Canadian Railway Company would follow suit further north in the Bow River subbasin to develop and settle lands they received as payment from the Dominion of Canada for the construction of their rail line across the country. And by 1920, there was approximately 190,000 acres of land being irrigated within the areas of the current St. Mary River, McGrath, Raymond, Tabor, Western and Eastern districts. However, by the late 1920s, private investment and operation of the irrigation projects would start to wane. And this was really in part due to the global economic depression, along with the large organizations' inability to provide secure and consistent water delivery services to the farmers of the region. It was at this time that we saw quite a shift from private organizations owning and operating irrigation projects to those organizations being run by farmers. Now, as Dr. Parsons outlined in his presentation just previous, from PFRA did assist in planning and engineering infrastructure through the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Southern Alberta to assist with growth in the infrastructure. So irrigation is practiced throughout all of Alberta's watersheds. A total of almost 1.7 million acres of land is under irrigation in the province. This represents about 4.7% of Alberta's cultivated land base. And it also represents about 71% of Canada's irrigated area. Now, the latter stat really means that Alberta, and in particular Southern Alberta, could be called the irrigation capital of Canada. There's approximately 300,000 acres of private agricultural irrigation in the province, and these are individual farmers who hold their own water licenses. They have full responsibility to divert and deliver water to their own parcels, and thus are fully responsible for the costs associated with this. Now in Southern Alberta, we have 13 districts located in a triangular area that extends from just east of Calgary, southeast down to Medicine Hat, along that highway number 3 corridor to Lethbridge, and up into the foothills adjacent to Waterton Lakes National Park. Most of our districts here and their predecessor organizations are over 100 years old. Districts operate currently under provincial statute, namely the Irrigation Districts Act, and every district is governed by a board elected from within their irrigators. Now, districts range in size. Our smallest is located just east of Medicine Hat and is 1,100 irrigated acres. And our largest is the district displayed in yellow, which is the St. Mary River Irrigation District with well over 400,000 irrigated acres. It's important to note that districts hold water license on behalf of their irrigators. And of course, our source water for our irrigation in this area is through our wonderful rivers that are fed by Rocky Mountain snowpack. Now, the conveyance system is essentially a gravity system, and it is extensive. Throughout this region, we have almost 8,000 kilometers of linear infrastructure that moves water from headwaters reservoirs through main canals, laterals, and pipelines right to the farm gate. Only about 4.7% of that linear infrastructure is owned by Alberta Environment and Parks. The remaining 95.3% is owned and operated by the irrigation districts. And in addition, there's 57 irrigation storage reservoirs located throughout the region that assist in optimizing conveyance to the farm gate. And we shouldn't forget about on-farm irrigation infrastructure. We have approximately 6,000 irrigators located throughout the 13 irrigation districts that own about 4,800 kilometers of their own pipelines, supplying water from the district point of delivery to about 8,500 pivot irrigation systems. So in southern Alberta, the primary purpose of irrigation districts is to convey and deliver water to the agricultural irrigators within their boundaries. And those agricultural irrigators have to be approved to irrigate their land. So the water really provides these producers with a guarantee of a safe, secure supply of water that ultimately results in an ability to grow and supply high-yielding crops. Producers in the southern irrigated region of Alberta are able to choose from more than 60 different crop varieties, including about 28 specialty high-value crop types. Now, sales of irrigation crop and livestock products on that 4.7% of Alberta's cultivated land base generate 19% of total primary agricultural sales in Alberta. The irrigation sales equate to about $2,400 per hectare, compared with about $329 per hectare for dryland production. That's about 7 times greater, and it really demonstrates the value of irrigation to crop production. But it is important to note that the presence of the irrigation infrastructure in southern Alberta provides benefit to other uses and users. So livestock operators, including intensive livestock feeding operations, are assured a consistent supply of irrigated forage, silage, and water for their operations in the irrigated region. About 60% of the province's feeder cattle are associated with irrigated farms. And many value-added processing facilities have located in southern Alberta due to the reduced risks that come with an assured water supply and the production of high-quality crops and livestock. Potato processing facilities, meat packing plants, vegetable packing and processing facilities are all directly connected to the water delivered through the infrastructure. These facilities in turn provide ready market access to producers while providing job opportunities for Alberta residents. Irrigation-related agricultural processing provides almost $1.7 billion to provincial Alberta GDP. And I also do need to mention that irrigation-related hydroelectricity production generates about $16 million in annual electricity. Tabor, Raymond, and the St. Mary River irrigation districts have been co-owners on a successful hydroelectric generation venture for about 25 years. And of course, all this means is that we have the ability to create jobs in southern Alberta. Of course, southern Alberta is typically a dry region, and this does have an impact on groundwater resources, with little quality groundwater being easily found in the region. So if you do think about southern Alberta, you quickly realize that the region's municipal development closely followed the construction of the irrigation conveyance system. Today, we have almost 50 municipalities located some distance away from surface water sources that are able to access water granted by their own water licenses through the irrigation conveyance system. Farmyards and acreages across the region also realize the benefits of accessing water through the system. And all told, more than 50,000 Alberta residents rely on water conveyed through the irrigation system for their daily domestic requirements. The cost savings realized by supplying non-irrigation agricultural, commercial, industrial, and municipal uses through the irrigation infrastructure in Alberta is about $45 million annually. Now, historically, the development of irrigation canals and irrigation storage reservoirs changed the landscape of southern Alberta. Where essentially no large natural water bodies existed, irrigation created reservoirs. Incidental wetland areas arose due to canal seepage and flood irrigation field runoff. Unfortunately, rehabilitation activities decrease incidental wetlands and habitat, but through the years, irrigation districts have worked with partner organizations to continue to develop wetland and upland habitat for wildlife species in conjunction with irrigation infrastructure. Currently, there are approximately 80,000 acres of wetland habitat that has been developed by irrigation districts on district-owned lands. Well, placing an economic value on this work is difficult, Some individuals have indicated the value of the work is priceless when considering these projects, and their associated wildlife, environmental, and recreational benefits will be available for future generations. So as I mentioned previously, we have 57 irrigation storage reservoirs located throughout the region, and they provide numerous recreational opportunities for Alberta residents and tourists. In southern Alberta, 22 campsites and day use areas are supported by irrigation, with many being located on storage reservoirs. Additionally, 29 golf courses in the southern irrigated region receive water through the irrigation infrastructure to meet their daily requirements. Irrigation-related recreation contributes about $15 million annually to provincial GDP. And placing a value on the mental health and wellness opportunities derived from water-based recreation is likely impossible, but one can anticipate that its value would be significant. And of course, on-farm goods and services are required for irrigation production, and they create additional economic activity through businesses providing and selling those goods and services. The first that comes to mind, of course, is the purchase and installation of pivot irrigation systems. In the period 2005 to 2015, it's estimated that irrigation farmers invested about $243 million on this efficiency improvement. But irrigated crop and livestock production also positively influences farm inputs, including things such as seed purchases, fertilizer and pesticide sales, agronomic services, and of course, machinery sales. These backward linkages create approximately 15,000 full-time equivalent positions across the province. So really, in addition to providing water security for agriculture and many other users across the region, irrigation has a significant overall impact on the economy by contributing about $3.6 billion annually to provincial GDP, creating about 56,000 full-time equivalent jobs across the province, and generating about $1.3 billion in annual revenue for the government of Alberta and the government of Canada. The economic value of irrigation in Alberta publication was a study that the association commissioned several years ago, and all of the stats that I've summarized for you today, and many of the stats that Dr. Parsons also referenced, are available through that publication at our website. I'm very pleased to report that our association has just commissioned a new study to take into account what has happened over the last several years in Alberta with regards to economic value of irrigation. We are hoping to have that study completed and published in spring, summer 2021. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and just talk about sector water conservation, efficiency, and productivity, and how that is positively influencing the sector's adaptation to a changing climate. So our CEP was really already well underway through ongoing rehabilitation and on-farm irrigation system conversions when our sector was asked to participate in a CEP program in support of Alberta's Water for Life strategy for an initial period 2005 to 2015. A number of CEP targets were identified in our plan with an expectation of success by 2015. And these included achieving a 30% increase in combined conservation efficiency and productivity, arriving at 70% of the irrigated area being under low pressure drop tube pivot irrigation, and achieving a 15% increase in efficiency relative to 2005 levels. Now, conserving water by increasing efficiencies within our sector has huge benefits. A 4.6% efficiency gain by the irrigation sector is a savings equal to the estimated annual consumptive water use by all municipalities in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, which is the basin that includes all 13 irrigation districts. Achievement of our CEP targets occurs through a number of different activities undertaken in our sector. And the first activity is on-farm upgrades. All irrigation systems have application inefficiencies or water losses. Flood irrigation that you see in the picture at the top sees high losses from runoff and resulting return flow. And that's simply due to the amount of water that's required to reach the lower end of the field and irrigate it. Over irrigation of the top ends of fields can have really negative effects on crop yield. Moving down to wheel line irrigation, which is seen in the bottom left of the screen, there's some significant water losses still observed in this irrigation system, most often through mismatching nozzle and irrigation set times to the soil water holding capacity, but also due to sprinkler pattern overlaps, the effect of wind on the water droplets, as well as bypass downtime occurring during a set change. So low pressure drop tube pivot irrigation systems apply water closer to the ground, droplets experience less evaporation, and the systems provide a more uniform application pattern. And this makes them right now the most efficient irrigation systems in Southern Alberta, with application efficiencies of over 80%. In addition to saving water, these systems use smaller electrical pumping units. They save labor, but new technologies are also allowing this to go even further with remote start and stop, as well as matching irrigation to field moisture sensors. And so these are some of the reasons crop yields are generally observed to be greater under low pressure drop tube pivots. The subsurface drip irrigation is slowly starting to come into play in Southern Alberta. We have a few irrigators who have moved towards this system, and we have some very good researchers based out of Lethbridge College who are investigating application methods and ensuring that future opportunities with subsurface drip irrigation can provide the irrigator with a good return on investment. So how much water saved? Well, when we talk about on-farm irrigation conversions, our irrigators have really embraced low pressure drop tube pivot irrigation systems over the last number of years. The charts here show the extent of the increase. In 2005, about 47% of the land irrigated in districts was irrigated using this method. By 2015, that number was 73%, and in 2019, it rose to 80%. That's a 7% increase in just 4 years. And that's significant considering the financial investment required to purchase and install one of these systems. And how much water is really saved? Well, for a farmer irrigating a 100-acre field by flood methods, converting to a low pressure pivot means he can add an additional 30 irrigated acres to his field, and all those acres obtained through the increase in, with all those acres obtained through the increase in the efficiency. So that means no additional water is used to irrigate the extra land. So moving on to district infrastructure, there's a couple of activities that we undertake that really influence our conservation efficiency and productivity. Our canals currently make up about 3,300 kilometers of our infrastructure, and efficiencies generally result from evaporation from water surface, seepage from the bed of the canal, and inadequate control of the water within the canal. So rehab activities such as installing impermeable liners, re-sloping the canal, re-armoring canal, upgrading with automated water control structures, and installing additional flow measurement devices all help achieve increased system efficiencies. All this work essentially helps optimize meeting water supply and water demand. Now, replacing above ground canals with buried water pipelines essentially eliminates water losses due to seepage and evaporation. Aggressive rehabilitation programs undertaken by irrigation districts has resulted in over 50% of the current delivery system being in buried water pipelines. In many cases, the pipelines are closed systems, which also reduces water lost as return flow. And it's really important to note that our irrigators get very excited when they hear that a pipeline installation project is coming by their parcels. In many cases, it's the impetus for farmers to make the investment in a conversion to a low pressure drop tube pivot. Pipelines are so much easier to pump from than canals. And I would say that pipeline installation and on-farm conversion really go hand in hand in Southern Alberta. So what were our improvements at the end of the reporting period? Well, we were initially targeting a goal of a 30% reduction in combined CEP, but we actually realized improvements well above that goal, seeing a 48% improvement. Efficiency improvements across the sector improved by 26%, and that was measured as a reduction in diversions from our source rivers. So really, this graph does a good job of depicting where we are. It is showing the depth of water diverted per unit of irrigated land between 2005 and 2019, using 10-year average intervals. When the targets for the sector CEP plan were finalized, districts agreed on keeping the depth of water diverted per unit of irrigated land below 445 millimeters. That's the orange line that you're seeing on the graph. Initially, the benchmark was proposed at 381 millimeters, but not all districts felt this level of reduction was possible. So a more conservative benchmark of 445 millimeters, which corresponded to the 10-year average 1996 to 2005, was agreed to. Now, as you can see from the graph, diversions have been well below this benchmark since 2005. And at the end of our first CEP reporting period, the average was 327 millimeters, which equated to that 26% reduction in diversion and a 26% increase in efficiency. Now, as expected, the average value has increased slightly over the last few years due to increased irrigation demand resulting from several years of drought-like conditions. But it is interesting that through these years, the value has stayed below the 445 millimeter benchmark and indeed below the initially proposed benchmark of 381 millimeters. So meeting the goals of the CEP plan has several benefits. Reducing diversions from rivers means that more water remains in the rivers to support healthy aquatic ecosystem. And everyone believes that that is an important benefit to conservation efficiency and productivity in the irrigation sector. But districts can expand their irrigated area with the saved water. So that allows irrigators to grow more product, which supports value-added processing facilities. And the graph above shows the growth in irrigated area that has been occurring. Between 2005 and 2015, districts were able to use saved water to expand their area by 5.2%. And from 2015 to 2019, they expanded again by another 4.5%. It's also important to note that districts are also allowed to make the water that they save through these initiatives available for other purposes. So this provides water for industrial and business facilities to support population growth in municipalities, as well as for wildlife habitat and wetland development. And the last topic that I'll touch on in relation to climate adaptation is reservoirs. Reservoirs mitigate the natural variability of river flow in southern Alberta by allowing the storage of water diverted during higher flow periods for use at later times during the year when stream flows are reduced. So our system in southern Alberta was really primarily developed to mitigate for those low supply conditions. Off-stream reservoirs balance the water delivery system by allowing water storage at key points to ensure quick and efficient delivery to meet irrigation demand. Several districts are now working on modeling projects that will better balance the water between their internal storage reservoirs to optimize irrigation demand and water supply even more. On-stream reservoirs are particularly key in assisting the province of Alberta in meeting its requirements to provide river flow to neighboring downstream provinces and countries, especially during periods of the year when river flows are typically low. Now, in recent years, we have observed the increased importance of reservoirs in flood mitigation. Instances of extreme events have taken place with both on and off-stream reservoirs seeing increased water diversion during these times to protect people and property. The 2013 event on the Bow system and the 2018 Tabor and area overland flood are examples. The majority of the water supply for Alberta's irrigated region originates in the Rocky Mountain headwaters as snowpack that melts in spring to supply irrigation reservoirs. Several current climate models predict changes to this snowpack with the possibility of more winter precipitation falling as rain. Constructing new or increasing the capacity of existing reservoirs are options that are being considered to adapt to a future with a more variable and extreme supply resulting from a changing climate. So just in closing, it is important to understand that the move away from flood irrigation to pivot irrigation, along with efficiencies realized due to infrastructure rehabilitation, means that today some of our districts irrigate approximately 3 times the area they did 100 years ago with the same volume of water that they diverted back then. Sector innovation and technological advancements have positively benefited water management in southern Alberta at the same time as conversations on climate change and potential adaptation have come to the forefront. The adoption of rehabilitation and on-farm conversion over the last 40 years is positive, and ongoing activities will continue to support sector adaptation to a changing climate while maximizing food production and food processing possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margo. Cognizant of time, and we might just eat into our break slightly, or we'll see what happens here with the questions. But we did receive a number of questions, both that can publicly be seen and also to me privately as the chair of this session. So perhaps at this time I'll invite Dr. Parsons and Dr. Blair to come back into the Zoom fold here, and I'll just read out the questions. There's a couple to some individuals, and then perhaps some group discussion. But if we could keep our responses, please. Just kind of a minute or two, and so hopefully we can get through the majority of them. So the first one is to Dr. Blair, and the question is, or the comment is that, so there's many benefits and threats to agriculture from climate change in a net scenario. Do you expect prairie agriculture to be a winner or loser, and does that vary by crop? Any thoughts about that, Dr. Blair?
Well, that's a really good question. It largely depends upon the response of the farming community. I mentioned in my presentation that extremes are really important. And so it's really important that there be resilience within the farm community, that there be a financial and infrastructural and operational resilience to deal with those extremes. In the long run, I have some worries. But when I hear these fantastic presentations about irrigation and the really active activities going on there, I have much hope. That was fascinating what's going on out west. So in the short term, the growing season and all that would be beneficial to increase precipitation, but the growing specter of those 10-year droughts that Dave Sachin worries about is very worrisome. But irrigation plays a role in there, that's for sure. So I'm sitting on the fence. I'm not an ag person. These people might have better ideas.
Okay, and while we have you here, another quick one. This one's a bit more of a existential question for you, Dr. Blair, but a lot of efforts are starting to curb carbon emissions. How much can they dampen these trends, and to what degree is the die already cast?
Well, the die is cast for substantial change. There's no turning back. It's all about turning that curve down. That the carbon dioxide curve and the greenhouse gas curve in general is heading up way too fast. There is hope out there that it's going to be turned down, that it's already turning down a little bit, but it's the timing of it that's so important. There's a point beyond which we start to lose control of how much we can do and how rapidly we can do it. So if I was forced to guess, I would say that we're going to end up between that low carbon scenario and that high carbon scenario. I sure hope we don't reach that high carbon scenario, because that's a really dramatic climate for us and for the world. The 4.5 or the lower carbon scenario that we present there is very optimistic, but something close to it is doable. We must.
Okay, moving over to Dr. Parsons, just a bit of a contextual comment and then a question at the end of this for you. So that was a fascinating primer on the fundamentals of water management to generate wealth and other social benefits. Part of it depends on increased local processing of food. Canada's history of domestic value-added processing is not stellar. Much of it grows just beyond infancy, then moves abroad. What would we need to do to secure it domestically? Dr. Parsons, any thought about that question?
Yeah, a long while ago, I worked on Alberta's nutrient processing agreement following the rehabilitations of the canals when Peter Lockie was the Premier. And it became a factor in encouraging that diversification of processing. I think there has to be a conscious focus on, in fact, capturing that piece into the provincial and the national economy. I also think it probably means coming to grips with the reality of the infrastructure requirements. And this is a difficult one, but changing the corporate dominance within the industry, bringing in, yes, the foreigners, the French to do the pea processing, the Swiss. You know, Glencore is one of the biggest food processors in the world. But everything has been concentrated to a large degree down east. And this is an area, in my view, where in fact the prairies can start to actually flex its muscles in the 21st century, and it should do so. And if we took over producing vegetables for Canada and shipping them east, great. But I think it needs a focus on that. And in some ways, it will mean pulling legs out from under the existing suppliers.
Interesting. Another question. This one's a twin billing for both Margo and Graham. And perhaps Margo, I'll ask you to make some comments, and Graham, you can perhaps bolt on to what Margo says in reaction. But the question is, it is easy to see how irrigation helps avoid droughts, but how does it impact, or is there any impact on potential of floods? Any thoughts about that, Margo?
Yeah, so I did kind of lead into that a little bit in my presentation, and I'll be forthright. You know, due to the variable water supply that was observed, 100 years ago, when the irrigation system was starting to be developed, it was really a system to mitigate for drought. But understanding that we're seeing more extreme events that are related to the flood and water management is slightly changing in southern Alberta, specifically following the 2013 flood on the Bow system. There is some reservoir management that is being done to help mitigate for future flooding. And as well, there's conversations around enhancing existing reservoirs, especially in the headwaters areas of that Bow system, so that we can mitigate for downstream floods a little bit better. So really, in terms of mitigating for flood, it is a lot about reservoirs and enhancing the reservoirs that we do have, and looking at potential future new reservoirs that could further be used in a multi-use purpose to not only mitigate for floods, but also mitigate for those drought, so that we're a lot more resilient.
Any further thoughts about that one, Dr. Parsons?
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that, and I agree with everything Margo just said, I think it's important for us to start to look at the reality that in fact our prairie river systems are regulated systems. For the most part, historically, they've been managed in quite localized settings, but increasingly we need to be able to manage them as more efficient system-wide settings, often within watersheds or major watersheds. But this also means being realistic about what we can do in terms of storage. And there is surface storage. The deeper and bigger the storage can be, the better it is with respect to evaporation losses. So if we can get deep reservoirs, so for example, on the North Saskatchewan, it's easier to have deep reservoirs than it is on the South Saskatchewan. But we should also be looking, frankly, at underground storage at the appropriate times. There's no doubt about it, though, that the development of the systems, whether it's with dams, with storage facilities, or the conveyances, whether they're pipelines or canals, these are holding huge amounts of water that become the places where the floods can go. And this hasn't been done to a degree. It's one of the reasons why I talk to a degree about waters moving from the North Saskatchewan south and from the South Saskatchewan north. At the end of the day, they're all moving into the same watershed, which ends up at Prince Albert. None of that changes, but it keeps a much wider landscape available to be essentially protected against both drought and flood. And so, and when they have floods, farmers want to get the water off the land. The question that they always have is, well, where can I put it? It's not that they can't handle their own land. They can't handle it if everybody around them is in fact being flooded. I mean, in the 2011 flood in Saskatchewan, for a farmer friend of mine, it was a 14-kilometer canoe trip to get to some high land off his farm. That's pretty widespread flooding. But it's also an area where there are options in terms of where to put it, and we just haven't considered these things. And we continually put them off. But I would make one last point, that there are civilizations around the world who have lived in dry conditions and managed their waters extremely successfully over the years. You can go to Jordan, and these may seem a long way away, but you know, they managed through these times. We're meant to be a smart people. We're meant to have smarts in universities. But it's time to start to apply some of the smarts. It's not enough to just study them indefinitely. And one of the reasons I put the kind of presentation together I do is because I have known personally, from personal involvement in the climate change world for at least 30 years, and the message actually hasn't changed a whole hell of a lot. It's getting warmer. It's going to be wetter in some places, more extreme events. It's going to be drier. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? Are we going to sit here and wait until it all blows away? Or are we going to do something about it? I argue it's time to do something about it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think with that, we'll leave that as the last, the parting thought for this first session. I really would like to extend our thanks to the three panelists this morning. Different kind of variations on a theme, but an incredible panel in my estimation. And I appreciate each and every one of you for being here.